misinterpreted. And so what I thought I would do is that all good talks begin with, let's see, no, that's not advancing. Let's see if I can do it that way. I have the first slide here. There we go, okay. As all great talks must begin with a little Shakespeare. And of course, you'll remember from your Hamlet, the magnificent character of Polonius. And in this particular lovely quote, actually, he's speaking to Hamlet's mother, Gertrude, and the new king, Claudius, misspelled, alas. But in any event, he says this, and I thought this would be a good way to get us off and working towards an understanding of Ruskin's mental illness tonight. Your noble son is mad. Mad call I it, for to define true madness, what is't but to be nothing else but mad. And now remains that we find out the cause of this effect, or rather say, the cause of this defect. For this effect, defective, comes by cause. And Gabe mentioned in his introduction Helen Viljoen, an American scholar who worked on Ruskin for 45 years. She was the subject of my talk last week. She worked on a magnificent biography of Ruskin, which would have been 4 volumes long had she ever lived to publish it. Alas, in her declining years, after collecting a massive amount of new material on Ruskin's life, she contracted multiple sclerosis, and then over a period of about a decade, she just drifted away, leaving her wonderful biography essentially in boxes, which are now all at the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York, via the inspiration provided to me by my friend and the great Ruskin scholar of the last century, Van Aken Bird. I've gone through massive amounts of Helen's legacy and found that in what she had collected would have provided a incredible reinterpretation of Ruskin's life from what Gabriel called earlier the traditional biographies. She was an indefatigable scholar. She liked to work. She always said one can only trust the primary sources. You go to the letters that he wrote, you go to the memoirs of the people who knew him and worked with him, and as you pile these together and sort them, etc., you come finally to an understanding of Ruskin as he actually was, as opposed to the way he is portrayed in many of the biographies that came afterwards, that were all based, as I explained last week, on essentially a Bowdlerization of Ruskin's actual life by the editors of this enormous series of books about his life that reproduced all his manuscripts, called the Library Edition of the Works of John Ruskin. There is no doubt that Ruskin, I want to say one more thing about Helen's work. She was going to call her biography Dark Star, John Ruskin's Dark Star. The last part of her biography she never wrote because of her illness, but the fundamental idea that she was going to come to was how Ruskin's mental illness developed in the last 15 or 20 years of his life and essentially destroyed what was left of his sanity. And there's no doubt about this. Ruskin had many mental attacks over time, as I'll explain a little bit later, the turmoil that he went through. On the left, we have his own self-portrait, which was done in 1874. And you can see it's a marvelous self-portrait, really. On the one side, the side of light, on the right-hand side, the right side of light it's on your left as you look at the picture, but on the other side is the dark of failure that Gabriel mentioned a moment or two ago. And on the right side is a wonderful photograph that was done of him in 1884 as he was getting older and had already had 3 different attacks, mental attacks that had driven him out of his mind. There are really 2 hypotheses that we really need to talk about tonight. One is what I call the congenital hypothesis. The idea that Ruskin inherited, I'll read that to you in a moment, but Ruskin inherited some kind of physical or genetic propensity to go mad, as many geniuses did at the time and later on in their lives. And the argument here is that, and I now go to the text in front of you, if that's true, then it may be argued that all of Ruskin's work is tainted by this imbalance and hence is of doubtful trustworthiness. However, and this I want, if there's almost anything I can convince you of tonight, and I don't have time to really give you all the evidence for this, there is no secure scientific evidence that can be used to justify such a claim regarding Ruskin or anyone else. In the essay on which this talk is based, I cite a whole number of scholarly references from the psychiatric literature and the biological literature that shows that it is simply impossible to draw a line that says, as we so commonly do, as we so frivolously do so much of the time when we say, oh, he's just inherited that from his mother or his father, or it's a weakness in the family line, whatever the case may be. We cannot, have not been able to demonstrate that in all the studies that have been done on this issue over now decades and decades of dedicated psychiatric and biological work. It's just not. To say that somebody has something is the easy, congenital in nature is the easy way out. It's an explanation we can rely on. It's speculative. We're not allowed to because we can't produce the direct evidence for it. And so it's a spurious kind of argument. There's a whole lot of stuff in the essay on which this is based, which Gabriel and I will tell you later on how to access if you wish at the end of the talk. But it's not possible to make that argument secure with any kind of scientific evidence. The second one, and this is the one that I'm going to be stressing tonight, is what I call the environmental hypothesis. And if it's true, whatever effects his illness may have had overall is where it is. There exists evidence proving and experienced a series of major negative events which in due course unhinged him repeatedly over the course of the last 2 decades of his life. And that's what I'm going to try to give you a sense of tonight. So we begin, as surely you expected, in Florence. We begin in the most beautiful Piazza Santa Maria Novella, which is one of the 2 great churches of Florence itself on your left in the picture, and so on. And to the right, you see on the right-hand side here, the first building that is sort of bleeding out into the right, a large apartment building in the piazza. And that's where I really want to begin, because the story really comes from the people who lived in that apartment building and Ruskin's life interacting with theirs. There's the apartment of Francesca Alexander and her mother, Lucia Alexander. Ruskin visited there in 1884. He was brought there by an English friend who knew of Francesca and her mother. And Francesca was sort of famous by way of rumor and story and so on for having written all these great stories about peasants in Italy at the time in which she was living, all these people which she knew. There are almost no pictures of Francesca. There's one of her in old age, which isn't really appropriate here. There's one of her mother in old age, inappropriate for the same reason. This is the only one I've ever been able to find of her in middle age, which was the time that Ruskin knew her. She's an extraordinary person. She was brilliant. She had a heart as great as the great Master Christ himself. She was so forgiving and loving and such a wonderful person. And Ruskin met her and her mother at the apartment, and he asked to see her stories of the Italian peasants, Francesca's stories of the Italian peasants. And so she produced them for him, and he loved them so much. He said, this is just what I need at this time in my life, my readership, because I want to convince them in the years that I know will be of some use to other people as I write on. I want to convince them that the simple life where you care for other people, that you're not after money, you're after taking care of each other, is the life that human beings should live. So he bought her book, which were all these wonderful drawings, which was full of wonderful drawings and stories and all songs, etc. He called it Roadside Songs of Tuscany. He said, I will publish this for you and people will come to know your story. And he did. And here's the the front cover of the first edition of Roadside Songs of Tuscany. And here, throughout Roadside Songs of Tuscany, which are a part of the library edition, Ruskin's library edition, which I told you before, but still you can get individual drawings of Francesca's at the top, and then on the left, both in English on the left, and then on the right in Italian, these songs that tell the stories of these peasants' lives. And it became wonderfully bought by huge numbers of people. It made Francesca famous in a way that she never expected to be before. And I wanted to show you this picture because I love it. It says, "Mi caro fratello," my dear brother. It is the beginning of a letter from Francesca to Ruskin, written in the mid-1880s. I don't have the rest of the letter in visual for you, but I wanted you to see what sweet, it was such a great delight to read her letters in the original, where I found them in various places and doing my research here. She has just this stunning hand. And this one is written to Ruskin, and it begins, "Mi caro fratello," my dear brother. Ruskin loved the Alexanders so much that he essentially adopted them into his secondary family. And she and he both called her mother Lucia Mamina, and then she, the mother, called Ruskin Filio, which means son, and he called Francesca his sorella, his sister, and she called him her fratello. The letters, there are hundreds of these letters that have essentially gone unknown ever since they were written. I stumbled across them because one day I was in Boston, oh my goodness, it must be 15 or 18 years ago. I was doing my general Ruskin work, and I knew there was some Ruskin material at the Boston Public Library. So I called them up and I said, "Can I come and have a look at it?" I said, "I think you've got 6 letters by this person and 12 letters by that person, and so on. I'd love to read them." The fellow said, Mr. Zit said, he said, no, we have 400 letters from Ruskin to Francesca and her mother, Mamina or Lucia Alexander. I said, "What?" So I went and I began reading these letters, and I knew that I had one of those things that almost never happen in the lives of scholars. I had a Ruskin goldmine, a set of letters that no one else, including Helen Viljoen, had ever seen before. So I dedicated myself to reading them one by one. I got a book called John Ruskin's Letters to Francesca and Memoirs of the Alexanders, which is the only published account of their friendship, written by a cousin or compiled by a cousin, Lucia Gray Sweat, in the 1930s. I think it came out in 1934. And I compared the letters I was reading in my own hands at the Boston Public Library with the letters that are in the book. And almost all of them, you're not going to be surprised if you were with us last week, almost all of them are bowdlerized. They are only certain portions of letters. Other portions that Lucia Gray Sweat thought would be embarrassing or somehow problematic for sales are left out. So once again, we have a major part of the Ruskin story that has never been told fully. It's a great book to get. It's still available on the web, but almost all of the letters are in one way or another altered, parts excised, some wonderful letters not reproduced at all, and the book contributed to this wonderful myth of Ruskin, and this relationship is a sweet and gentle relationship, which it really was. But throughout it all, Ruskin meets Francesca and her mother in 1884. Throughout it all, and they stay his dear friends until the very end, Ruskin is undergoing these massive doubts about himself and is in a state of depression almost every day. I found this little bit on the web just today. It's a little excerpt from a Ruskin letter. I don't know to whom it was written, and I don't know when it was written. The date exactly, except it's in the mid-80s. I know that because I know this literature so well. So I want to go back. And Ruskin writes in this little bit that he composed, "And all this blessed day," he says, "I've done nothing but write one doleful I underline doleful, letter to Francesca, and a doleful note to Kate G, who's really Kate Greenaway, the artist, whom I will talk about at some length in the talk next week. How that creature, he means Kate Greenaway, does love me or. But it's the two words doleful that I want to focus on, because what I would like to do next is I'd like to give you a sense of what Ruskin's mental illness actually was. There have been a number of studies done before this one that I'm going to tell you about, which I conducted. There have been a number of studies over the decades that have essentially argued one of two hypotheses. The first hypothesis is that Ruskin was a manic depressive, or that Ruskin had what we now call, Ruskin was a schizophrenic. And there are various essays, again, I cite all of these in the essay from which this talk is derived, which claim this. When you look at any of these essays, what you find is sort of what I was telling you before about this congenital inheritance hypothesis. There's just nothing. These people don't really know what they're talking about. They don't really know what manic depressiveness is. They haven't done a study of it. They've heard somewhere that that was probably it, so they write it down that that was it. Or they heard that he was schizophrenic, and they write it down that that was it. He was neither of those things. There's a manual image is here. It's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This is the 4th edition, or DSM-4. TR means text revision. The first edition, the first version of this came out, then was slightly revised. It came out in the 1980, late 1980s, and it is the fundamental diagnostic tool that psychiatrists around the world use to determine whether a person has one particular mental illness or another. When you go to the DSM-4 TR and you look up schizophrenia and you compare it to all the hundreds and now hundreds more because of the Alexander letters, hundreds of letters that Ruskin wrote in the 1880s to various recipients, you find that he shares maybe 3 or 4 of the 12 principal characteristics of schizophrenia, and 3 or 4 of the principal characteristics of manic depressiveness. And so he doesn't come along as a strong candidate for either of those. But what he does come along for is another diagnosis, and I want you to see, again, a great self-portrait of Ruskin's done in the 1870s. You see the same construction of the face that you saw in the earlier one, which I showed you on his left side, which is the right side in the picture. We see the dark, we see the brooding, we see the unhappiness, we see the misery. And on the left side, or the right side actually of his actual face, we see what is bright and wonderful about him. He is already worried in the 1870s that he's going to lose his mind. This painting was done for his great American friend, Harvard professor Charles Eliot Norton, became one of the executors of Ruskin's literature. Ruskin was so unnerved, but he had pain. He didn't send it to Norton. So he gave it to Jones Severn. But it was bought I'm just mentioning this for some of you who were at last week's talk. It was bought eventually before the great Brentwood sales by a collector by the name of F.J. and he gave it an inheritance to Helen Viljoen. Could you not hear me, Gabriel? Oh, can you hear me now?
We hear you now, I think.
Well, I don't know. How long have I been out?
15 seconds.
Oh, that's okay. Okay, so here's my argument. And again, all of this is outlined in great detail in the essay that I've mentioned before. What Ruskin had, I'm utterly convinced, and I would argue that anybody who looks at the data that I have looked at will be convinced as well, is something that's called major depression with psychotic and melancholic features. And I'm not going to belabor you with a lot of this tonight, but it's all there in the letters that you can see. But there are a whole host of symptoms that are attendant with major depression with psychotic and melancholic features.
Jim, we don't have any visuals.
You don't have my visual? Okay. Well, I don't know what's happened here. Can you see that? No,
Oh.
I have an unstable connection, I've been told.
Yeah.
You cannot see that. Okay. So I think what I'm going to try to do is log out and log back in. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, let me try it. Can you see this? No.
We're still looking at you. You got to share the your screen, not your camera.
Right.
Can you see this?
Jim, you have share screen is what you have to do.
Okay.
We've lost the slideshow.
All right. I'm trying to come back in. Am I back in?
No, not yet.
Okay, I'm on the Zoom. I've reopened Zoom, Gabriel.
Yes.
Mm.
Are you
Now.
sharing the screen?
I can, right? I go to speaker view, go to share screen, go here.
There we go.
There we go. Okay, good. Now let's go to slideshow.
Right.
No, we have it. And I'm going to go from current slide. How about that?
Perfect.
Excellent. Well, the modern technology is wonderful sometimes. Okay, so did you see this? Did you see the letter from Ruskin? Did you see this?
Yes, yes, we saw both.
Okay, so you're there, and I'm at the point where I'm talking about this particular
Yes.
self-portrait of Ruskin's,
Yes.
and sharing with you the traits of his major depression. I'm just going to read you a few of these because I'm going to share with you a little bit later some letters. In fact, immediately after this, I will share with you a letter that Ruskin wrote to Joan, which has many of these traits manifest. I do this with about 10 different letters in the essay to show that the definition works. So here are just some of the traits that someone who has manic depression with psychotic episodes have. Onset typically occurs between the ages of 30 and 40. These are all yeses in Ruskin's case. 2, once the disease commences, most of the afflicted experience between 4 and 9 major depressive episodes over the course of the rest of their life. Yes. Often the depressions are accompanied by periods when the sufferer is identifiably psychotic. Yes. In some cases, the depressions and symptoms are chronic. Yes. Unlike other disorders such as schizophrenia, between depressive episodes, the person functions well. Yes. Before, during, and after a major episode, many experience intense agitation, both motor and mental. Yes. A sense of racing or crowding thoughts, a tendency to speak quickly and sharply. Yes. When psychotic symptoms surface, they are often accompanied by delusions. Yes. And so on. There are about 7 or 8 more, which I won't share with you at the moment, but basically I'm trying to give you a sense that all the characteristics, every one of the characteristics of major depression with psychotic episodes are Ruskin's. Whereas if you go and look at what the characteristics of schizophrenia are, you get 4 or 5, and those irregular. If you go to manic depression, you get 4 or 5, and those irregular. Okay, back to that, because I want to stay there for a moment here. So to give you just one sense of it, I'm going to read you a bit of one letter that Ruskin wrote to Joan in the latter part of the 1880s, and he is in Sandgate, and I will get back to that in a moment as well, on the South Coast. And he writes this to his cousin, and I want you to keep in mind as I share this with you, the traits that I just read. He writes to his cousin, he says, "The day is cold and the wind is howling, and I am in a darker than ever state of, not so much depression as fear, which I think it best to tell you of as simply as I can. In the state from which you rescued me at Brantwood last year," they had a big falling out in 1887, "there was distinct aberration of my mind. I could not eat because I thought we had not enough for the next day. I was thankful for my tea, however. I thought I was dying. But though I believed you would be sorry if I died, I did not feel as I do now about what that would mean to my Donny," that was his pet name for Joan, or to the Sorella, who was Francesca, "if I did die. But now it seems to me that my mind is better and enters into everything rightly, but the bodily strength is far more dangerously broken, and that every hour I stay in this hotel in Sandgate makes me fear being laid up in its upper room, plagued by the sound of the sea day and night, and having people rushing up and down from London. The actual state of my health is, well, total loss of any care for food, which I attribute chiefly to chagrin. The digestive power itself does not fail. I go into an unconscious heavy sleep, which does not give me any feeling of refreshment. Gradually, I think it is increasing and I'm feeling worse. I am feverish, I should say definitely feverish, despondent all the time, and dislike everything, and dislike every person around me, and I have a total inability to enjoy myself. How much wiser and happier other people are than I, and how much wiser and happier I ought to have been. Oh, Donny, how miserably all this is written. Oh, Donny, what a total plague and burden I am to you now." There are no fewer than 9 of the traits of major depression with psychotic episodes in that letter. And this letter is typical of many dozens of letters in those that survive, particularly in his correspondence with Joan, and particularly in his correspondence with Francesca and his mother, or her mother. So now a brief rehearsal for those of you who came away or who were at the talk last week of the major events that brought on Ruskin's major depression. There was first, Helen Viljoen said, there was first this enormous struggle with his parents and particularly his father over the direction his life would take. This is John James Ruskin, Ruskin's father in later life, and they were constantly at odds with one another. None of that struggle is portrayed with anything but sort of a side glance in the library edition of Ruskin and all the biographies which followed. This is Ruskin in 1870, about the same time as that picture was taken of his father. You can begin to see the stress creeping into his face as things worsened between him and his parents. And this is a wonderful letter that he wrote to Lady Trevelyan about the ruinous struggle, which I did not share with you last week. And the underlinings are mine. She is asked in a previous letter that she sent to him if he was ill, because he doesn't seem to be himself. He says, "There are symptoms about me now which may be nothing or may be everything, but I am better than I was, and when I can be quiet, it seems to me that some strength is coming back. But the least bustle or worry puts me all wrong again. I know my father is ill, but I cannot stay at home just now, or I should fall indubitably ill myself also, which would make him worse. He has more pleasure if I am able to write to him a cheerful letter than generally when I'm there, for we disagree about all the universe, and it vexes him, and much more than it vexes me. If he loved me less and believed me more, we should get on. But his whole life is bound up in me, and yet he thinks me a fool. That is to say, he is mightily pleased if I write anything that has big words and no sense in it, and would give half his fortune to make me a member of Parliament if he thought I would talk there, provided only that the talk would hurt nobody and was in all the papers. This form of affection galls me like hot iron, and I am in a state of subdued fury whenever I am at home, which dries all the marrow out of every bone in me. And then he hates all my friends except you, and I have to keep them out of the house. A ruinous struggle indeed. Viljoen argued that the ruinous struggle stayed with Ruskin to his last day, and she's quite right about it. He never got over the great struggle with his parents. It began here many years before, and very few people know of this letter, so I thought I would share just a little bit of it with you. 1829, Ruskin is 9.5, on the verge of 10. His father is in Carlisle selling sherry. Ruskin is sending him his school lessons by the mail. And the father reads one of his Latin lessons and responds as follows. I must commence this letter by exclaiming, wonderful, 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 this Latin lesson you have just sent me. If you do all this without being told, it is as much a wonder as anything I have ever met with. I'm astonished at your understanding it so well and writing like a classic author. And now comes the most important part. You, he says to his 9-year-old, are blessed with a fine capacity and even genius, and you owe it as a duty to the author of your being and giver of your talents to cultivate your powers and to use them in his service for the benefit of your fellow creatures. You may be doomed to enlighten a people by your wisdom and to adorn an age by your learning. It would be sinful in you to let the powers of your mind lie dormant through the idleness or want of perseverance when they may, at their maturity, aid the cause of truth and of religion and enable you to become in many ways a benefactor of the human race. I am forced to smile when I figure to myself the very little gentleman to whom I am addressing such language. I call the letter The Charge, because this is what Ruskin was charged to be by his parent, whom at the time he loved very much. He was going to be a savior of the human race. And I would suggest secondarily to you, I don't know what your own experience has been, but this is quite a charge to put onto a little fellow when he's 9 years old and to say that I expect you in the course of your life to save the world, which is of course impossible for anybody. So this is the seed, I believe, of Ruskin's great and enduring and ever-growing sense of failure, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. The second major catastrophe in Ruskin's life was his marriage and then later divorce to Effie Gray. This is Effie. She is married to Ruskin at the time this drawing was done. It was drawn by the fellow who would become her husband, John Everett Millais, handsome fellow, don't you think, who was a painter, Ruskin's protege, and traveled with the two of them to Glenfinlas in Scotland for a number of weeks in 1854, where Millais fell hard in love with Effie, and Effie with Millais, which set the whole divorce situation in motion. I don't know whether you know of a book, I want to mention it now, by Robert Brownell, Brownell. Robert is an English scholar of Ruskin who has written a book called Marriage of Inconvenience. And he unpacks in his book for the first time why the Ruskin marriage fell apart. It is commonly thought that it fell apart because Ruskin was sexually inadequate. I'll talk more about this next week. And because he was a misogynist, he really hated women and he hated his wife in particular. None of that is true, which again I will talk about next week. But the fundamental notion was that Ruskin was to blame for the collapse of the marriage. The truth of the story is that, as Brownell has found out by the letters that were unpublished or that are at the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York, the the matter is that 2 weeks before the marriage occurred, Effie, what he with her father to the Ruskin family estate, and because they wanted to get rich by him. And Ruskin, being the moral soul that he was, did not, that's one of the things that dissuaded him from any physical attraction towards her. There was a great scandal when the divorce came about. Ruskin was the fellow blamed. Effie went after him in public day after day, time after time, with scurrilous comments about him. And Ruskin never said a word about her in public and only occasionally in private. So he took the brunt of that. And for the rest of his days, it came back to haunt him. The third major event was what I call, or what Helen Viljoen called, the Turner crisis. Ruskin loved Turner, as Gabriel told you at the top of the hour. This is the painter, Turner, John Millard Everett, well, I'll come up, William Turner. Anyway, loved Turner, loved all his work, thought he was a genius, which he was, thought he did the most beautiful paintings in the world, which he did, and he must be pure in heart if he was able to do such wonderful things in art. And of course, what happened was that when Ruskin was going through Ruskin and Turner's 20,000 drawings and paintings that were left at the time of his death at the National Gallery, he found that Turner had engaged in erotica. And here's one of the pieces of the Turner erotica. All of this to Ruskin was absolutely scandalous, pornographic. It was, remember, 1858. And at the time, Ruskin's worldview fell apart. And he said, everything that I have done and said in terms of claiming that only the pure of heart, those who were really godlike people, could see the wonders of creation clearly, was wrong. So this was a major intellectual catastrophe for him. His work had failed. And the last major component of the crises that Ruskin, well, the next to the last actually, was in 1859. He's 39 years old, and he fell in love with a young Irish girl by the name of Rose Latouche. And here's his beautiful drawing of Rose when she was a late teen. That is at Brentwood, his Ruskin's home now. And it's a very fraught relationship. Books have been written about this, the best by my friend and colleague, Van Akenbird, still available if you would like to find out more about it. But it was fraught for all sorts of reasons, not the least of which is that the marriage story came back to haunt Ruskin when he wanted to marry Rose. And she herself over time developed what we're quite sure is anorexia nervosa, went out of her mind, and in 1875 died in a hospital bed in England looking like this. This is Ruskin's drawing of her. He was 28 or 29 years older than Rose, but he loved her the way Romeo loved Juliet. He loved her the way Tristan loved Isolde. He loved her. He adored her. He worshiped her. He wanted her to be his wife, and she left, and he was alone. And this is another one of the major things that contributed to the mental breakdown. In 1878, it all really goes south for the first time. Ruskin is in his bedroom at Brentwood up on the first floor, surrounded by his Turner paintings, and it's in February on a cold and windy night in 1878, and he goes out of his mind. He has his first psychotic attack, and he's in essentially a state of psychosis for about 6 weeks. He eventually comes out, he gets better, he resumes his life, he resumes his writing, but he is damaged. And then in 1880, it happens again. And then in 1882, it happens again. And then in 1886, it happens again. And then, as we'll find out a little bit later, in 1889, it happens, and most damagingly again. He goes through these periods of essentially losing his mind. He called it going crazy with the hairs. And he has these delusions, these crazy fantasies in his life. And later on, always being honest, he tries to analyze this. And here is his own analysis of what caused him to lose his mind. It wasn't all those other things. They were there. He writes this in a forced clavigeral letter in March 1880. He says, the doctors said that when I went mad this time 2 years ago, it was from overwork. Well, I had not been working more than usual, and what was usual with me had become easy. But I went mad because nothing came of my work. People would have understood my falling crazy if they had heard that the manuscripts on which I had spent 7 years of life had all been used to light the fire with. But they could not understand that I should be in the least annoyed, far less fall ill in a frantic way. What happened? Did we just lose it again?
We still see it.
You can still see it. Okay, good. Let me, but they could not understand that I should be the least annoyed, far less fall ill in a frantic manner, because after I got them published, nobody believed a word of them. The first calamity would have only been misfortune. The second, the enduring calamity under which I toil, is humiliation, resisted only by a dangerous and lonely pride. The failure of his work that Gabriel mentioned at the top of the hour, it is with him every moment of every day, as you will see as we move along. His cousin, Joan Severn, this is a picture of her at her desk in Brantwood. He lives with her from the late 1860s on, her and her husband, Arthur, and their children at Brantwood, and many times they do not get on very well together. There's a serious confrontation that they have in early 1877, which I will talk about in the next talk. They fall out very seriously. Joan takes her whole family and moves to London. Ruskin stays at Brantwood, half to 3/4 out of his mind. She comes back. He's still half to 3/4 out of his mind. They can't get on. So Joan and Arthur decide that he can no longer live in his own home in Brantwood, and they take him in September of 1887. They take him to the south coast of England, where he stays first in this hotel called the London and Paris Hotel, all by himself. He wants to go there because he thinks there he'll see Turner skies again. Later on, he moves to a second hotel. It's here on the left. I'm not quite sure which one it is. This is in Sandgate, just down the road from Folkestone, which is where the first hotel was. And he writes desultory letters after desultory letter to Francesca and Joan. He's barely staying above water. And then he decides that the only thing he can do is to go on his old road again. And so he takes his manservant Baxter, and he's accompanied by Arthur Severn, and he goes on the old road, which will eventually wind him up in Bassano del Grappa, near Venice, in a few months. They board at Calais, they come across to Calais, they stop at Amiens and Abbeville, they go to Beauvais, they go to Paris. All this time Ruskin is half or more out of his mind, which I'll show you in a moment. They go up to Genève. They stay in Genève where all of the same things go on. They go to Shamuni and Mont Blanc, which I will get to in a moment. Then they cross the Simplon Pass down into Milan, across the northern part of Italy, stopping briefly at Verona, and then going up to Bassano del Grappa. That's the outgoing route of the last trip on the continent on Ruskin's old road. With them is Arthur Severn, Joan's husband. He's a painter, a good one, but not a great one. He has a very, very powerful taste for living well and living high, for eating and drinking and consorting with women. He uses Ruskin's money primarily for that because he doesn't make a lot of money on his own art. With them is Peter Baxter on the right. This is a late picture, but the only one I've ever been able to find of Baxter and Ruskin, probably in the late 1880s, maybe a little earlier. Baxter, who was with him all the time as his manservant. And now, to give you a sense of what Ruskin's mental state was like on this road, we take him to Genève, to Les Berges Hotel. Ruskin stayed in these top rooms all the time because he could see from them the Alps. And as you can see, glorious indeed. He's going back to the places that he has loved most in this life, but he is not well. And so, let's see, that's not, there we go. Baxter writes Joan this after a few days in France. He says, Madam, I hope you will excuse this hurried note, but I wish to let you know how the master is today. He changed his plan early this morning and is going to stay another week, he says. Very typical of people with major depression. Last night he scarcely slept any, and he kept Mr. Blow. Oh, I forgot to mention, in Beauvais they meet two young architects, great fans of Ruskin's. They're carrying around Ruskin's books, studying the great cathedrals of Europe that Ruskin has written about. And they meet them at dinner one night. One fellow is Sidney Cockerell. The other one is Detmar Blow. They both go on to become famous architects and art people in England. And in Paris, Arthur, who doesn't like being with Ruskin any more than he needs to be, goes back. Detmar Blow stays on with Ruskin and Baxter, and Sidney Cockerell returns to England as well. So, but Ruskin is not well, and I'll go on with this letter. So Baxter tells Joan last night he scarcely slept any, and he kept Mr. Blow up the whole night, swearing at him awful sometimes. Poor young gentleman feels it very much, and he looks so downhearted today, and it is quite nervous, and the master has said some very nasty things to him, which I know Mr. Blow feels very much. He sent Mr. Blow for me at 2 to 4 this morning and wanted coffee. And then he swore at me until he had to give up through sheer exhaustion, and it hurted his throat so much. He has had Mr. Blow and I to the Louvre again today, again all morning, and he got hold of a French artist there, and he's commissioned him to do some copying of a part of a picture. He has been buying books and photo engravings, but he has done nothing very bad yet. He's going to write to you to ask you to send him minerals and pictures and dear knows what. I have just been thinking if you would say to him that you will ask Mr. Severn, who has already left for England, to bring them to him. Perhaps that will cool him a little bit, but he is much better again today. I fear the night coming. He is perfectly conscious of all he says and does, but everyone sees that he is off a great deal. And when I interpret this letter in the essay, there are 3, 6, 7 major traits of major depression in this one little bit alone. I'm having trouble advancing this. Okay, they finally wind up in Shamuni. Here's Turner's drawing of the entry to the Shamuni Valley. Not a very good reproduction of it, but it gives you a sense of why Ruskin loved it so much. Ruskin always stays at the Union Inn in Chamonix. I've circled where his rooms are. They are, of course, on the top floor and looking at the best view of the entire valley. This is from the same time. Before I get to the last part of the talk, I want to take you to Venice for just a moment, and I want to show you a little bit about this church, which Ruskin makes quite a great deal of in the last volume of The Stones of Venice. This is Santa Maria Formosa. It's about a 5 minutes walk from the Piazza San Marco, which of course is the great jewel of Venetian architecture. And Ruskin, of course, knows every place in the city, and he goes to Santa Maria Formosa, which is a late Renaissance church. And if you look at it, just take a moment to look at it, you see how essentially unadorned it is. And if you walk around it, it's so plain compared to the medieval and the Gothic churches of the time. And if you walk around it to the side, you find something that absolutely horrified Ruskin when he came across it. On the south wall, the wall that faces towards, in the direction of the Piazza San Marco, you find this incredible, ugly face. And Ruskin is horrified by it. And he says about it, I just wanted, here's just a quote from the Stones of Venice, the 3rd volume. Ruskin describes the head as huge, inhuman, and monstrous, leering in bestial degradation, too foul to be either pictured or described, or be beheld for more than a moment. And in fact, he found the head to be so repulsive, he would not put a picture of it in the Stones of Venice because it said it would spoil his book. but he would talk about it. And here's what he said. In that head, and this is pivotal for the last part of Ruskin's trip on the old road. In that head, he said, is embodied the type of the evil spirit to which Venice was abandoned in the years of her decline. And it is well that we should see and feel the full horror of it on this spot and know what pestilence it was that came and breathed upon this great city's beauty until that beauty melted away like the white cloud from the ancient field of Santa Maria, Formosa. This head is one of the hundreds which disgrace the buildings of today's Venice, all the more or less agreeing in their expression of sneering mockery, in most cases enhanced by the thrusting out of the tongue. Evidences of a delight in the contemplation of bestial vice and the expression of low sarcasm, which is, I believe, the most hopeless state into which the human mind can fall. This spirit of idiotic mockery is the most striking characteristic of the last period of the Renaissance, the period I call the grotesque. So Ruskin, The Stones of Venice is essentially a 3-act play, like Ruskin, that Gabriel was describing Ruskin's life earlier. The rise of Venice, its glory years, and then its degradation into the Renaissance, which Ruskin disliked because beauty became essentially the spiritual kind of beauty that Ruskin adored, such as here, had all fallen away. This is one of Giovanni Bellini's most beautiful paintings. Ruskin said it was one of the 2 most beautiful paintings in the world. And it's in the Church of San Zaccaria, itself about 5 minutes walk to the east of the Piazza San Marco. It's a glorious painting. It's just been cleaned, and it looks like this. And I'm going to show you the front of it for just a moment, or the primary area of it. And if you compare it in your mind's eye to the ugly head, you see the change that has come over Venice. It's a religious painting, but it doesn't need to be interpreted as a religious painting. For in it you have the figure of all womanhood and the figure of all childhood. And note that the child is not some idealized version. It's a real living child. And to the left and the right, you have these attendants on the child. It's a celebration of life and the goodness of life and the beauty of life. And the little girl at the bottom is playing a very sweet tune. And it's that compared to this that Ruskin is so horrified by. And these things are working inside of him all the time. It is part of his failure. So they leave Milan, they cross the top of Italy, they go to Verona for a couple of days, and then they cut north to Bassano del Grappa, which is where Francesca and her mother are waiting so anxiously to welcome their fratello and filio. And he arrives there. This is the entrance into Bassano del Grappa. He's barely holding on to sanity. He arrives there, and this is, I went and found it some years ago, this is the Palazzo Rezzonico in Bassano del Grappa. As you can see immediately by looking at it, it is a Renaissance building. And while he's there, and they hug and they love each other, and they're so glad to see each other, Francesca and her mother take him out to the garden for tea. And this is what he sees in the garden. These are all Renaissance portraits, right? They are things that Ruskin loathed. Also in the garden, this is not the sacred conversation of Bellini that we saw a moment ago. And in that garden, think of the head on the side of Santa Maria Formosa. We have this sculpture of this, I don't know who he is, in the garden. These are what Ruskin sees when he gets there. They go inside the house. Here's a bronze of a woman, essentially largely undressed, and her child. Another baby, think of the baby in the Sacred Conversation portrait a while ago. Baroque designs in the rooms, Baroque designs in the bedroom, none of the beautiful and gentle and loving and sweet things that Ruskin so admired and tried to tell us were so important to have in our lives. And on the staircase going up to the first floor is another great and horrible head inside the house. Freud said, sanity is based on two things: the ability to work and the ability to love. Ruskin's work is all in front of him on this trip as an utter failure. It is not he who is won. It is the Renaissance who is won. His life has been a failure. So the first pillar of sanity for Ruskin, in Bassano del Grappa, we have lots of letters that talk to us about this, collapses. There's a second story. While he's at Sandgate, he goes to London so he can see some of the great pictures of the world. And he goes to the National Gallery and he finds a young woman living there by the name of Kathleen Olander. She's in her early 20s, very lovely girl. And they begin talking and he says, well, I can help you learn to draw if you'd like to learn to draw. And she says, fine. And they meet there a number of other times, and Ruskin goes to the National Gallery. And they like each other very much. She really likes him and he really likes her. And they start a correspondence. And they keep corresponding while he's on this last old road trip that I've just mentioned, been talking about for the last 20 minutes or so. And they come to admire each other so much, and Ruskin begins to fantasize that he and Kathleen might get married. He's been alone now for he's been alone for 13 years since Rose has died. And so here's a bit of his letter of 25th of September, 1888. He sends it from Milan. That little postscript in your last letter of the 22nd sent me quite wild with joy, for now, because you can be to me all I need, so I can be to you. Rosie was always furious with me for loving her better than God, and I didn't, but I loved God better for the gift of her. But the moment I saw you in the National Gallery that day, I thought he means God, had sent me literally to save me when nothing else could but love. That's his emphasis. In recent days, I was getting ill again, but the two letters I received this morning are new life, and you will be happy with me while yet I live, for it was only love that I wanted to keep me sane. In all things, I am as pure except in thought as you are, for it is terrible for any creature of my temperament to have no wife. One cannot but go mad. Now, Kathleen is this lovely, innocent young girl. This has been a wonderful relationship for her with this great man of the age. It has all been gentle. It has all been sweet. And now suddenly in a letter, he's suggesting that she be his wife. There's 40 years between them. She's utterly shocked. She doesn't know what to do. So being a good and obedient young woman of the 1880s, she takes the letter to her parents and shows it to them. And they are horrified. They've heard all the stories about the divorce. They've heard all the stories about Rose. They think this man is crazy. They think he only bodes their daughter ill, and they forbid her to communicate with him again after she sends him one more letter, breaking it off, which she does. The day after, he's still at Bassano. He's still at Palazzo Rezzonico. He's got her letter, and he writes her back. The next day, on October 5, Ruskin wrote back, my Kathleen, I have your grievous letter of the 1st. I will be to you always what you bid, and love you always as you choose. My vain thoughts of what might have been shall be put far away. Forgive me the deeper sorrow they have caused you. I doubt not that you have judged rightly. A sin would be in my letting you sacrifice your youth to my sick old age. And so, in a matter of 3 or 4 days, at the Palazzo Rezzonico in Bassano, both of the pillars that Freud says are necessary to maintain mental health collapse. The next morning, October 6th, Ruskin rallies Baxter and Detmar Blow, and they go to Venice, and they don't even tell the Alexanders that they're leaving. If he gets to Venice, he thinks, I can see Turner's Venice, and I can go to the Frari and see the other picture that I think is the most beautiful in the world, another Bellini called the Madonna and Saints, Madonna, Child, and Saints. It's in the Frari. It's glorious. It's recently been cleaned as well. But that's not what he sees. That's not what he can see. What he sees all around Venice are some of those hundreds of ugly faces that are Renaissance faces. This one's on a building on the Grand Canal. This one's on the cusp of a bridge under which all the boats travel. I have pictures of dozens upon dozens of them. They are, when you start looking at them and seeing them, they're virtually omnipresent. So in Venice, purposefully, he sees few. Reviewing the few observations from this time we find that all reiterate the unhappy themes we have been discussing. Mr. Ruskin took some small rooms on the highest floor of the Hotel Europa. His friend Count Alvisi Zorzi reported. He was ill, and during the first days of his stay, he did not even go out. Later, he visited the Ducal Palace, St. Mark's, and other churches, but never on foot. He always went out in a gondola. He met a few times with the minister of the Scottish Church there, a Reverend Alexander Robertson, who reported the following conversation. When I had occasion to refer to the marvelous influence of his work, and in particular mentioned something wonderful which had been said of it by the late Professor Drummond, who had been in Venice shortly before Mr. Ruskin said, I am astonished. I feel as if I had only led a selfish and useless life. The depression was unrelenting. He saw the Brownings. He loved the poetry of both Brownings. He met them. He met his friends Robert and Elizabeth Browning, and their family were there, and somehow they learned that he was too. Would he join them for tea? They would be so very delighted. Reluctantly, he agreed. Although intensely interesting, their daughter-in-law, Fanny Browning, would later recall, it depressed me terribly to see Ruskin in such shattered state of health. It was after one of his bad illnesses. Once, when speaking of South London's Dulwich Gallery and trying to remember the name of a picture or artist, he exclaimed, "Oh, this poor old brain of mine, it's of no use anymore." And in a flash, my father-in-law, Robert, replied, "Ah, but think of all that has gone out of it into other people's." But all of this material that I'm presenting to you is new. None of it has been in any of the standard biographies because nobody really thought to look. After a week or two, it proved impossible to stay. I am in more pain than I can tell you, he told Alessandro Alessandri in a letter. There have been symptoms of mental illness threatening me now for some time, which I cannot conquer. But by getting away from the elements of imagination, which haunt me here. He means the ugly faces and the failure of the stones of Venice to change the world. I cannot stay here longer, he reported to Francesca on October 16th. I'm going to cross the St. Goddard Pass in the shortest time to get into some alpine air. Write to me at Fleulen and give me a thorough sister's scolding. Look at the self-recrimination there. I am too sorrowful and too much ashamed of myself in every sort of way to send a word of message. Signed, your poor Fratello. All of these are indices of major depression. This is the road back from Venice, up through the St. Gothard Pass, down to Fleulen, across to Lucerne, and eventually back to Paris, where Joan will collect him in about 6 weeks' time. As they go through the St. Gothard, if you've ever seen this painting, it is so glorious. It is Turner's painting of the pass of Fido on the St. Gothard Pass. And Ruskin, of course, sees it on his return visit, and he writes to Joan this the following day. We had a beautiful day to pass the St. Gothard. He told Joan in a letter of October 18, sent from Fleulen, but the beauty of the old scenes now merely mock me, unless I could have my Joni to show it to. And I don't in the least know what to do now. It's a radiant day, and I never saw the mountains more lovely, he said in another letter, which he sent his cousin from the same place 2 days later. But it's all of no use to me, and how much less the telling of it to you when you are anxious, as you must be now, about your poor, foolish Donnie. He really cracks on this last bit. He loses all. He wanders about confused. He wanders about angry, depressed, and in self-recrimination. This is a Turner painting of Fleulen, which is the entrance to the St. Goddard Pass. He cannot see it. They arrive eventually back in Paris at the Hotel Maurice, where he always stays. And they stay there for a couple of weeks. Ruskin is essentially out of his mind. On December 3, just before he leaves and goes home, he writes this to Francesca. This is a letter which, by the way, was never sent. Oh, I guess I talk about it at the bottom. Let me read you the little bit, and then we'll talk about that. He said, I have your lovely letters. They were forwarded here from Merlingen, and I must tell you of a fearful thought that was on me this morning in the dark. I was thinking how Joni and you and I were all three of us such loving people, and if our lives were quenched, how much power of loving would be quenched. As I pass the average crowd here, I notice more especially than in England the noble faces of the Legion of Honor gentlemen, each indicating all that is best in training and intellectual character. Still, one feels that when these pass away, others like them will come. But if your face and Joni's were taken away, and here the letter ends, never sent, Joan found it among his artifacts after his death and sent it to Francesca. She does as she has promised and he has begged her to do for months. If I can get this to advance. Strange how this is
You need to
working.
wrap up. Yeah.
What do we need?
You need to wrap up a bit.
Yeah, I'm almost done.
Okay.
Yeah, but I got to get this to advance.
Sure.
Well, I think continental zooming has its issues. See if I can get it to go back. Seems to be locked here. Maybe what I'll do, Gabe, is stop the share and start it up again. Okay, I'm going to do it anyway. Okay. Now, darn. Okay. Here's what to do. I can't think of anything else to do. This worked last time. All right, now let's see if I can go back to slideshow, go back from current slide, and advance it from there. Well, I'm at least learning how to do that. She takes him back to Brentwood. There's virtually nothing left of his mentation. Brentwood is very lovely in these days. This will be the last part of it. This will be 1888, now 1889. His bedroom, where he went crazy for the first time, is on the first floor up above it. The circle down below is his study. He does almost nothing. He works in his study, writing a few letters, not very many, writing one last chapter in Praetara to his biography. But most of the time, he sits at the window and looks out on the scene, which is of Coniston Lake and the beautiful mountain called the Old Man, of which is symbolic of him across the way. Sidney Cockerell comes. I was going to read you another letter, but I won't. Sidney Cockerell, whom he met, is now the curator of the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, and who, with Detmar Blow, had met Ruskin on the old road in Beauvais, came to visit during a winter in the mid-1890s, and reported the brief time he spent with him as follows. I found Mr. Ruskin sitting in his study, gazing out vacantly, or so it seemed, on Coniston Water and the mountain the locals call the Old Man. There was a little book on his knee, his hands encased in fur mittens. I was not sure that I was recognized. Did Mr. Ruskin remember Detmar Blow? No. He looked tranquil, rather wistful and shrunken, but otherwise very little changed. In fact, since I had last seen him some years before, his hair was still dark and very thick, and his beard still had a trace of brown. It was like interviewing a ghost, but very wonderful. He's with Joan to the very end. He dies on the 20th of January, 1890, never bettered much. They had a wonderful funeral for him down in the local church in Coniston. They raised, or rather said, Mr. Collingwood's wonderful stone cross honoring all phases of Ruskin's life in the churchyard outside St. Andrew's Church. And that was more or less the end of it. Many years later, not so many years later, Lucia, Ruskin's Mamina Alexander dies, and then Esther Francesca Alexander dies. They are buried in the Protestant cemetery outside Florence. So the story I've told you tonight, what I've tried to tell you, is of a, you know, at the very end, since I began with Hamlet, at the very end of Hamlet, when Hamlet is dying and Laertes is holding him in his arms, he says, "Now cracks a noble heart." And I think that this is a story about the cracking of a noble heart. None of this is told, none of this story that I've tried to communicate to you tonight is told properly in the biographies. All the biographies note that Ruskin went mad. They're quite right about that. All of them suggest, almost to a one, that it was a congenital illness that brought him down. They are quite wrong about that. What brought down Ruskin was all the things that came upon him, sort of like adding first bundles and then more bundles to the back of the camel, and then finally the last straw. And he went out and he could never come back. Ruskin was felled, and I've only been able to give you a very little bit of the evidence tonight, was felled by a disease known as major depression with psychotic episodes. No one has ever diagnosed him with this before. I have much more evidence that I could show you in service of that hypothesis. And so we lost a great mind. At the very beginning of the hour, I said that what we need to do is to work our way through these two hypotheses so that we know whether Ruskin and his work should be continued to be treated seriously. They should, because in my view, Ruskin spent his entire life trying to help human beings. And when he couldn't, the sense of failure, added to which all the other things, the ruinous struggle, the loss of Rose, the calamity of the marriage, the Turner crisis, all of these other things simply brought him down. So that's Ruskin's mental illness, a reinterpretation. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Jim. Wonderful. We've got some time, I think, for some questions. As I indicated last time, Jim's open to receiving further questions by email at spates@hws.edu. So that's also an option. But if any of you have questions, this would be a good time.
Gabe, it's Ted Bosley here. Thank you, Jim, so much for another excellent presentation, and thank you, Gabe, for putting this on. This is really, really terrific, and it's nice to see so many kindred spirits on the screen. My question is about these catalytic events, and the first one in particular, the ruinous struggle that you mentioned, Jim. At the tender age of 9, who knows how heavily those words fell on his ears and on his heart from his father. I wonder if you could say something about the religious aspect of that charge, and how that might have contributed to or was complicated by the ambiguity that he later felt towards the religion in which he was brought up. And I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Right. Good question. And I really didn't say much about this, though. I think I mentioned it in the first lecture. Ruskin was brought up as in a strict evangelical household. His mother was the primary transmitter of that tradition. When her boy was born, she dedicated him on the day of his birth to the service of God. And then as soon as he was able to pay any kind of serious attention at all, she started reading him the Bible from the first verse of Genesis to the last of Revelation, and then back again, and then back again, and then back again. And as he got older, she made him read aloud the Bible, training him all the time that every word of the Bible was a direct revelation from God. So that's the first part of what I'm going to essentially answer. Second part is, by the early 1850s, all sorts of changes are happening in the natural sciences, particularly in biology as affects this part of the story. Particularly in biology and geology, discoveries are being made that essentially, as they pile one upon another, and there were dozens upon dozens before Darwin comes along. Darwin comes along in 1859 with The Origin of Species. But all of these studies essentially begin to undermine the belief in the strict interpretation of the Bible as absolute truth. Well, Ruskin is a smart and honest guy. And so he reads all of these studies, and he begins to realize that the stories that he's been told in his religious background are somehow fabrications. They're not true. They might be allegorically true or symbolically true or something of that nature, but they are not literally true. So the strength of his religious beliefs in evangelicism begin to fall away as early as the early part of the 1850s when he's writing The Stones of Venice. And by the time he gets to the end of the 1850s, 1858 and 59, and discovers the Turner erotica, that's the last straw, because he truly believed that only the pure of heart, the people who were like God in their human guise, could see the wonderful things of nature. And Turner absolutely had erotic, carnal, lascivious, salacious interests. And how could that be true? So that became another straw on another camel's back. And in 1859, he gives up his evangelicism and he becomes what he calls is a pagan. He never gave up his belief in Christ and the idea that Christ lived a great life that should be the model for us all. But he gave up all his belief in formal religion. He never went back to formal religious services again. In fact, if anything, in the 1870s, he was so tempted to be given his history of in looking at all these wonderful things in Italy and France, he was very tempted to become a Catholic. But as soon as he voiced that, all his friends said, you can't do that. No one will ever read a word that you say again if you do that. So he didn't do that. So his religion falls away. He never becomes what I would call irreligious, but he becomes very dubious of anything in organized religion. If you read the late works, there's essay after essay where he accuses the priests and the ministers of England of being essentially the handmaidens of the rich, that they only say the things that the rich will like. They never criticize the rich. And so he becomes so deeply opposed to them. So religion is always important in Ruskin's life. There's a great little book that probably almost nobody knows called The Bible Teachings of John Ruskin, which is still out there on the web, which you can find, is a compendium of hundreds of the things that he said about the Bible and about the meaning of being a spiritual person in life as well. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but I guess what I should say in conclusion about this is that it becomes another element in making him think that he was wrong about everything in life. There's a letter in the 1860s where he says, everything I've been taught is a lie, by which he means everything he's been taught by his parents is a lie. And that's why he becomes a pagan and lights out on his own. Okay, that's enough.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. Yes, that answers my question. Thank you very much.
Good.
Someone else?
Anybody else?
You know, there was the moment in the presentation when the audio, at least on my end, garbled a bit, but it was at a key moment when you were discussing the divorce with Effie and going through the reasons why the usual reasons are not true. And then you went on to say the real reason, and I lost that. Could you quickly just tell us?
Sure, I can, and I will probably do a little bit more with this in the next talk next week when we're talking about Ruskin's sexuality. The short answer, and people who don't know the full literature on this might find this surprising. The short answer is that there was nothing wrong with Ruskin sexually at all. But again, untoward events caused all these problems that led to the divorce and led to the vilification of Ruskin in the public eye and so on. So the thing that I was saying when your audio dropped out, for which I apologize, was that there's a wonderful book that I highly recommend by Robert Brownell. It's called Marriage of Inconvenience. And what Brownell has discovered, which no other Ruskin writer has ever done because they haven't taken the time to come to America to read the letters, is that in letters that exist at the Pierpont Morgan in New York, it becomes very clear that about 2 weeks before the wedding occurs, Ruskin learns indubitably that his wife to-be doesn't really love him, and that she and her father are in collusion because her father is virtually broke, to marry him, that she will marry him and gain access to the Ruskin fortune. This is not an unreasonable assumption because John James Ruskin and his wife, who want Ruskin to be married because that's a respectable thing to do, settles on Effie before the marriage, settles on her 10,000 pounds as her own money. She can do whatever she wants with it. Now that's a really considerable sum in 1847, 1848. So the idea that they can get access to the rest of the Ruskin monies is very seductive. Ruskin is a deeply moral man. These are things that he finds abhorrent, that his wife, A, or his wife to be, A, probably doesn't love him, B, and she is in collusion with her father to essentially rob his father of some of his money. So there are letters that show that he really was in love with her, that he wanted to marry her, that he thought he would have children with her, and this all put him off. And so he is no longer really interested in this because he regards his wife, after they're married, as an immoral person. Now, your next question is going to be, I know it's going to be, your next question is going to be, why did he go on with it? When he knew this, why did he do this? And the answer is really twofold, and both of these things are talked about in Brownell's book. Number one, he did it because he thought in time she would change. He thought this was a momentary indiscretion. Well, after they were married, what he found out quickly, and then over time more and more and more, she didn't change. She was a pretty shallow person. She really was interested in frivolous things. She wanted money. She loved using money, and she never really did change. Number two, it would have caused, Ruskin was one of the 2 or 3 most, well, all right, I'll give you 5, most famous people in England at the time. And it would have caused this enormous scandal if this had been broken off. Ruskin would not talk about what went on, what he had learned publicly. He refused to do so because he thought it would be, on his part, it would be ignoble of him to expose his wife or his wife to be in a public setting. Effie didn't abide by that because she called him out many, many times for being, quote unquote, an unnatural man, which everybody took to mean that he didn't want to have any kind of sexual relations with her. And he offered to her, even after they were married, the opportunity, but she turned it down. So I just said more than I said in the lecture, but that's kind of an answer to what you asked, Mark.
Thank you.
Mark, I'm going to put up, this is actually a copy of the Brownell book, if anyone's curious. So this is what
Gabriel, hold it up higher. There you go.
There we go.
Yeah.
Marriage of Inconvenience. It's a forensic analysis, as you can see from its length, a forensic analysis of the Ruskin marriage. So
it's a really good book. It's a groundbreaking book, really. Right.
Okay.
Well, thank you all for being a good audience. I apologize for the techno glitches, but apparently they're part of the game these days.
Yes. Just a point that Jim made earlier, if you're interested in reading fuller versions of this material, Jim's monographs on the Ruskin biography are available on his blog, yruskin.online. And also we are recording these lectures. So the previous one was recorded, this one has been recorded. And these we will post both on Jim's blog and on the Ruskin Art Club website, www.ruskinartclub.com. So lovely to have you all again. Please join us next week for Ruskin Sexuality, Correcting a Century of Misinformation and Misdiagnosis. We'll see you all then. Thank you.